We were all really, really, really happy for you that your kids are all doing well in Los Angeles. And I'm going to be very brief because Jim talks a lot.
You have the nerve.
You could see why we're friends. We go way back. I know, Jim and I have known each other for decades, and I'll give you just a little bit of a background on him. I guess the only thing really I have to say is go Bills, right? Is that all I have to say? But anyway, I'll go into a little more depth. Jim is from the Niagara area, Niagara on the Lake, Buffalo, whatever, and he went to a lesser-known university, University of Pennsylvania, and who would go there? And Boston College Law School, and Boston University, sorry. Boston University Law School. Anyway, Jim has been an attorney, a longtime attorney in Orlando. He was a circuit court judge for many years. He is the leading scholar on attorney fees in Florida. He wrote the textbook on it, and even at his advanced age, he's still very, very busy. He's just absolutely a terrific guy, but his love after Audrey and his family is LBJ. And,
Henry next.
oh yeah, I had his family, I said, yes. Oh yeah, Henry, his son, who is a resident, came all the way from Tacoma, Washington to see him. And he is newly engaged and adorable, and he's going to be the best doctor in the world.
He is the best.
Anyway, so he loves LBJ, he loves Robert Caro, and maybe one day we'll be blessed to hear about Robert Moses.
Lori was supposed to say, but she forgot, that on this day in 2025, 25, Jim Hauser spoke to the University Club. Okay. All right. We're going to go to at least 11:15 because this is going to take about an hour. And this, again, for any of you who like to read, this is the third volume of Robert Caro's incredible series on Lyndon Johnson. You can finish it within a day or two. As I say about Robert Caro, his books are a page turner. You cannot put it down, but every time you turn a page, there's a little bit of regret because that means you're one page closer to finishing. Without question, the best historian / political science writer of our time. I don't know if the Nobel Prize has to go to someone who writes fiction, because this is definitely not fiction. How he's not won the Nobel Prize is beyond me. Okay. How did LBJ pass the 1957 Civil Rights Act? Literally trying to put the camel through the eye of a needle. It was impossible. The positions of the liberals, the positions of the Southern conservatives were diametrically opposed, and there was simply no way that you could ever come up to a compromise, except Lyndon Johnson found a way to do it. Let's put stuff into context, and as our previous speaker said, in the 50s, in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, the public, the white public, was beginning to realize the incredible injustices that were taking place with black Americans. Prior to 1945 or 46, black Americans might be lynched, they might be killed, and it would make the black press, but it would not make the mainstream white press. 1946. All right, let me start. In the 1940s, blacks served honorably in the American Army. They go to Europe, they go to France. They're not treated as second-class citizens. By God, they're treated as heroes, as they should be, for liberating Europe. So when these black soldiers come back to the United States, they're not going to be willing to accept second-class citizenship. They fought and died for the United States. They should be able, at the very least, to have the same rights and the same rights as other citizens of the United States. 1946, Isaac Woodward. The reason Mr. Woodward is wearing dark glasses, I don't know, I know that some people in the audience know about the story with Mr. Woodward. He takes a bus from, I think, Norfolk, Virginia, where he was dropped off after serving in the Army. He's in uniform. And as he's passing through Georgia, the bus driver says, "You've got to get in the back of the bus." And Mr. Woodward says, no, I'm an American soldier. I don't have to take second-class citizenship. He's summarily thrown off the bus. Word gets out to the South Carolina community where he's dropped off. His eyes are gouged out. President Truman, from the slavery state of Missouri, and not necessarily a pro-civil rights person, at least prior to this time, is outraged, absolutely outraged. This is not how you treat American soldiers. So in 1948, President Truman issues a decree integrating the armed forces. This continues. People are getting outraged, they're getting upset. Things are happening. I cannot emphasize enough how important it was that Jackie Robinson integrates baseball. Prior to that time, most Americans truly felt that black Americans were inferior in everything, and that there was no way that any black American could play baseball and be on the same level as the famous major leaguers like Joe DiMaggio, Ted Williams, etc. 1947, Jackie Robinson is hired by the Brooklyn Dodgers. He plays for the Dodgers. He's incredible. He's taunted and spit upon, and racial epithets are hurled at him. He never loses his temper, although he's furious inside. And as a result, people are beginning to respect black Americans. One of the people who really respected not necessarily Jackie Robinson, but someone who loved baseball, was the senator from Georgia, Richard Russell. He loved baseball. And one of the things that comes out in the Caro book is that the two most powerful legislators, Richard Russell and, for the life of me, I can't think of it, Joe, who was the Speaker of the House in 47, 48, Sam Rayburn, were both very, very lonely men. They were not married, and on the weekends, they would be very, very depressed because they had nothing to do. Well, one of the things that Richard Russell loved doing was going to baseball games. And the Washington Senators were in the American League, so he couldn't see Jackie Robinson play. But he did see a black center fielder for the Cleveland Indians, Larry Doby. And Larry Doby, I think, was MVP that year, most valuable player, which Josh Allen should receive this year for the Buffalo Bills, but very well may not, because people don't like the Bills, even though they should know better. And he would watch Larry Doby play, and Doby was fantastic. And by the way, 48 was the only time the Indians won the World Series. So all of a sudden, the mood's changing. Maybe black Americans are not second-class citizens. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. The United States Supreme Court rules that segregation in the public schools is unconstitutional. Immediately, the Southern legislatures, especially the senators, enacted the Southern Manifesto, saying that Brown was wrongly decided and we're not going to follow it, and we're going to use every legal means possible to block it, block its enforcement. And when I say every legal means, there was also a hint and a wink, illegal means would be okay as well. Now, every Southern senator signed the Southern Manifesto except the two senators from Tennessee and Lyndon Johnson. One of Johnson's co-senators from Oregon thought, for Johnson, this was one of the bravest things any senator had ever done. But not so much. Why? It didn't take political courage if your goal in life is to be president of the United States. And Johnson's eye was always on the presidency. So he knew if he signed the Southern Manifesto, he might not be elected president. So he was never going to do anything that could affect his ability to be president of the United States. 1955, and for this next photograph, it is extremely hard to look at, and if you don't want to, that's fine. This is the body of a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till. Emmett Till was in Mississippi. He lived in Chicago. He whistled at a white woman. He not only was killed for that outrageous act, he was mutilated and tortured. This outraged America, incredibly outraged America. And what was incredible, there actually was a jury in this case. There was actually a jury trial. It took the jurors an hour to find the defendants not guilty. And one of the jurors joked, the reason it took an hour is we wanted to get a free lunch. 2 years later, 1956, I think, early 57, the two murderers, and I say murderers, not alleged murderers, confessed to committing the crime. They were paid $4,000 by Look magazine to give their explanation as to why they committed the crime, which back then was a lot of money. But they knew they could not be prosecuted because of double jeopardy. LBJ's emotions, and Caro does an incredible job of explaining them. And he could be incredibly empathetic. Johnson, as a young boy, 15, 16, he actually picked cotton under the broiling Texas sun. He knew how hard it was to be able to make a living going forward, trying to just pick cotton, just trying to get by. In order to level the dirt roads in Texas, he had to put on a harness like you would a mule or a horse to help level the road. And Johnson was always a very skinny young boy, not very strong. And this was incredibly painful. And Johnson realized that the only way any of his friends and colleagues could ever move up in life was through education. So that was something that Johnson always believed was important. After he graduated from college, he taught at a poor Hispanic school and absolutely made these students believe in education so that some of them were able to have successful careers. Now, Johnson's feelings toward the poor and the black, unlike many of us, was not purely intellectual. It was viscerally emotional. He understood their feelings. He could feel their pain. He could feel their humiliation. But when ambition and emotion or compassion collided, ambition always won. So Johnson's eye was on the presidency, and no matter how he truly felt about civil rights was irrelevant. His goal was to be elected president. 1956, his two wise men, Jim Rowe and Phil Graham. Now, does anybody know about Phil Graham? Lori Pearson Weiss does. Phil Graham was the half-brother of Bob Graham, publisher of the Washington Post, the husband of Katharine Graham, but it was Phil Graham that made the Washington Post the Washington Post. A brilliant, brilliant man, a great believer in LBJ. And Jim Rowe, does anybody know anything about Jim Rowe? Oh, gosh, my other audiences knew. Jim Rowe was one of FDR's brain trust, brilliant, brilliant lawyer. But what many people don't know is that Jim Rowe was the architect of Harry Truman's 1948 campaign. And he did a state-by-state analysis of what Truman had to say and do in each of these states in order for Truman to be reelected president. And as all of you know, or should know, Truman went into that race with an approval rating of 25%. Nobody expected Truman to win, and he put off one of the great political upsets of all time. They both told him the following: Lyndon, there's no way you can become president of the United States unless you are seen as passing a Civil Rights Act. It's not enough to be for civil rights, you must pass the Civil Rights Act. Well, that's sort of difficult for Johnson because all of his supporters from the South, and of course the South is going to do everything it can to prevent civil rights. Now, there's a short episode in the Caro book describing Lyndon Johnson's acting ability. You ever think of Johnson as an actor? He tells Jim Rowe, you got to help me on the 1960 campaign. And Rowe goes, look, I've seen how you treat other people, Lyndon. There's no way in hell I'm ever going to subject myself to that. Well, would that stop Johnson? No, that's just the beginning of the pressure put on Jim Rowe. Johnson had a heart attack in 1955. So what happens? All of Jim Rowe's friends start calling him up. How can you do this to poor Lyndon? He's going to die of a heart attack if you don't support him. You've got to support him. You've got to support him. No, I'm not going to work for that man. Finally, Johnson goes and sees Jim Rowe personally. And and Johnson goes, Jim, you got to support me. You got to support me. And Jim Rowe says, no, you're wasting your time, Lyndon. I'm not going to do it. Johnson literally, maybe figuratively, but literally, gets on his knees and starts crying. Jim, you've got to support me. You've got to support me. No, Lyndon, I'm not. Oh, my God, Jim, you've got to support me. Finally, Jim goes, I can't take it anymore. Okay, Lyndon, I'll support you. Immediately, the tears go away. Johnson goes, gotcha. Don't you ever say anything about Lyndon Johnson. Only Lyndon Johnson speaks for Lyndon Johnson. I gotcha. You're working for me. See you Monday. Okay. So, as I said, Johnson must not just fight for civil rights, he must win. And it can't be the Republican Civil Rights Bill, it's got to be the Democratic Civil Rights Bill. 1960, there's been a mass migration from the South, black Americans, to the North. So the Electoral College has changed in favor of the North. There are 104 electoral votes in the southern states, not counting Texas, but there are 223 electoral votes in the North. Almost, 3/4 or 4/5 of the number necessary to elect a president. Now, Republicans can count as well as Democrats. And all of a sudden, civil rights now becomes not just a moral issue, but a political issue because those individuals supporting the Civil Rights Bill will have the support of black Americans, and that can be the crucial difference in any election. Thus, the South was expendable in order for someone to be elected president. 1956, the Republicans proposed a civil rights bill, incredibly strong civil rights bill, outlawing segregation, demanding voting rights for black Americans. It's supported by Eisenhower, and it's written by the Attorney General of Eisenhower, Herbert Brownell. And it was also supported by the President of the Senate, who was a Republican. Who was the President of the Senate? Tough audience. Who? Yeah. Who? Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is vice president, and he's president of the Senate. You know, he always was a great supporter of civil rights until it became politically inexpedient for him to do so. So it's Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon are mirror images. If the 1956 Civil Rights Bill passes, that's going to absolutely destroy Lyndon Johnson because it'll be a Republican bill, not a Democratic bill. So LBJ pleads, and again, great actor, pleads with his mentor, Sam Rayburn. The relationship between Johnson and Rayburn, Johnson was Rayburn's literal, a figurative son, and maybe even prodigal son, but certainly his son, that's how close the relationship was. And he says to Sam, you've got to delay the Civil Rights Bill. Delay it, delay it, delay it, so the Senate doesn't have to vote on it, and I don't have to come out either in favor of it or against it. It passes on July 23rd. It's not able to get to the Senate in time for the Senate to vote on it because the Senate adjourns on July 23rd, so LBJ dodges a bullet. LBJ could read men, not just read them. He could look in their hearts and see their emotional, what made them emotionally strong and emotionally weak. And he could bend strong men to his will. At least according to Caro, Hubert Humphrey was also almost a sycophant to LBJ. The liberal senators called LBJ leader, even though Johnson would screw them over and over again. He'd always throw them a bone every now and then to allow liberal legislation to pass. But in addition to reading men, Johnson had the timing of a playwright. He knew when a line could make the whole difference between legislation passing and failing. As you will see, he becomes a producer, a director, and an actor, and the casting director of the great United States Senate and the great debate on civil rights. He understood the line message versus messenger. It's not what the message is sometimes, it's who's delivering the message. And of course, he was a genius at passing legislation. LBJ could not let the Republicans pass the Civil Rights Bill in 1957. He had to take credit for the Civil Rights Bill, not the Republicans. Oops. Unfortunately for the civil rights advocates, in the Senate, there were 8 major subcommittees. 5 of them were chaired by Southern Republicans. And the power in the Senate has not and has never been in the majority leader of the Senate. It's been in the committee chairman. So in a fight between Johnson and a committee chairman, there was always the very real chance that the committee chairman could win and burst the aura of LBJ's invincibility. Think of Kevin McCarthy a year or two ago as majority leader of the House, and Matt Gaetz was able to get him dethroned. So these 5 Southerners have such incredible power. And Johnson realized, just like Kevin McCarthy did 60 years later, if he tried to take on the Southern barons, he could lose his majority position because out of 49 Democratic senators, 22 of them were Southerners. And how bigoted and racist were these senators? Oops, we don't know. Senator Eastland, I never want to be in the same room as an N person because they smell so badly. Harry Byrd, we cannot allow integration because if we do so, we will create a mongrel race. Senator Englander of Louisiana and agriculture. Any chance he could put in the congressional record the N-word, he would do so. And one of the greatest racists of all is Florida's own Spencer Holland, a, quote, true racist. You know, Spencer Holland, former governor of Florida, United States Senator, and founding member of Holland and Knight Law Firm. How can Lyndon Johnson persuade these racists to support civil rights? Well, all the Southerners wanted a Southern president so they could actually become a part again of the United States. They all respected and followed Richard Russell, the great senator from Georgia. And Richard Russell wanted Lyndon Johnson to be president. He thought he would be a great president. And so basically Russell said to the Southern senators, you gotta give Lyndon some leeway. We gotta give him something so that Johnson can become president. they wouldn't support, but they wouldn't oppose a weak civil rights bill. Now, the fact was that virtually all the senators outside the South were supporting civil rights. All of the Republicans, because Eisenhower was demanding that, and virtually all the Northern Democratic liberals and Western liberals. But the South had some weapons, the most powerful of which was Rule 22 of the Senate Rules Committee, which allowed the South to filibuster. And I say, in other words, you'd have unlimited debate to prevent legislation from passing. And it was delay that was going to be able to be the great power for the Southern Democrats. Now, it helped not just the South, but it helped small states like Montana, Rhode Island, Wyoming, back then even Washington State, where some famous people are presently living, including my son. And so they believed in the filibuster, and they wanted to preserve the filibuster. My wife is now leaving. So it would be delay, delay, delay. I'm going to stop the speech entirely until she comes back. And I say damn, 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 because the United States Senate was a dam against progressive legislation, and every time that the tide would get higher and higher, the dam would get higher and higher as well. A filibuster had never lost. Oops, excuse me. Let me go back. Okay. A filibuster had never lost. But LBJ told the South it might lose this time, that they could not afford to pass, they had to pass a weak civil rights bill. He let them know that if we pass a weak civil rights bill, Johnson truly had a good, earthy sense of humor, it would be they could pass a bill as powerful as a popcorn fart. And if it was a weak civil rights bill, you don't have to filibuster. So Johnson is not focusing on passing the civil rights bill. He's focusing on preventing the South from filibustering him. And time is going to be on Richard Russell's side. If they filibuster, nothing will get done. There'll be no Middle East bill that was desperately needed. There'll be no armed services funding bill. There'll be no appropriations bill. And most importantly, there'll be no Niagara Falls Power Project. And why was that so important? Because Jim Hauser grew up in Niagara Falls. And who was building the Niagara Falls Power Project? Does anybody know?
Robert Moses.
Robert Moses. And do you remember in the book about the chapter on Niagara Falls?
No.
No, and why don't you?
Because it was cut out because the book was already 5 billion pages long.
Right, as Laurie said, it didn't make the cut, which was very upsetting to Jim Hauser. Okay. Nothing, no chapter, nothing. All right, so Eisenhower in 57 proposes the 57 Civil Rights Bill. It outlaws segregation, and that's the heart and soul of the bill. And that is the portion of the bill that must be passed. There cannot be any compromise. And in that section, there's no right to a trial by jury. Richard Russell now draws a line in the sand. No, the right to a trial by jury is a sacred American right guaranteed by the Constitution. You must have the right to a trial by jury. Excuse me, go ahead. My former one. You must have a right to trial by jury. And if you don't get rid of trial by jury, Title III must go. The liberals are saying, nope, you've got to have the strong Title III, and there has to be right to a trial by jury. Obviously, no common ground. How can you compromise this? How is LBJ ever going to convince the Southern senators to vote for the Civil Rights Bill? He knew he couldn't, but could he convince them not to filibuster? And the answer is going to be yes. Johnson realized that the most important thing was not what was in the Civil Rights Bill, of course that was important to the liberals, black Americans, and everyone else in America, but for Lyndon Johnson, it was not what was in the Civil Rights Bill, but there actually be a Civil Rights Bill. As I said before, Johnson told the Southern senators they didn't have any allies, that the Northern Dems and Republican senators would be unified. He had to convince them not to filibuster. He had to convince them that unless they could block cloture, and cloture was blocking unlimited debate, they had no hope. So he convinced them, you know, the South, you only need 33 votes to block cloture because there had to be a vote of 2/3 of the Senate in order to block it. Now, some of you who remember that there's 2/3 of 100 is, oh my goodness, 34 senators. But back in '57, there was no Hawaii, no Alaska, so only 96 senators. The South had no allies, but Lyndon Johnson had an idea. They had no allies, but the Western senators had no allies on Hell's Canyon. The immediate reaction of the audience is clear. What the hell is Hell's Canyon? And what the hell does Hell's Canyon have to do with the Civil Rights Bill? Well, Hell's Canyon was a dream of the great Western liberal senators, Magnuson, Church, Senator Mansfield. They wanted to have public power. And if you built a huge Hell's Dam, you'd be able to get that hydroelectric power that could absolutely help so much of Western America. Now, the liberal Western senators have been pushing this bill for 10 years. They needed to get funding from the federal government. They got absolutely nowhere. And Johnson realized, you know, the Western senators are sort of for civil rights, but because they didn't have many black constituents, they could afford to take some chances that maybe some other senators couldn't take. So, Johnson's idea. We'll get the Western senators to support the South's right to filibuster. The Southern senators will agree to money for Hell's Canyon and agree not to filibuster the right to put the Civil Rights Bill on the Senate calendar. One of the slides that I didn't show, there were going to be 4 or 5 times that the South could filibuster. When the bill comes over from the House, you can filibuster as to whether or not it goes to the Senate Judiciary Committee. You can filibuster whether or not to put the Civil Rights Bill on the Senate calendar. You can filibuster about taking the bill off the Senate calendar after debate. You can filibuster whether or not there are going to be any amendments to the Civil Rights Bill. And then you can finally filibuster on the merits of the bill itself. So the South needed a proof that the Western senators would be there on the filibuster issue if they needed them. Joan Lieberman, do you believe in magic? You know, that's a problem with the shows in this organization. They don't say what you want them to say. Yes, you believe in magic. Yes, you do. Everybody but Joan. So, Joan, you have to leave the rest of the lecture. On June, after there's a compromise, the compromise is agreed to on or about June 6th. Magically, the House bill comes out of the House Judiciary Committee that was being chaired by a staunch segregationist, Judge Smith. Magically, translated, Sam Rayburn calls up Judge Smith, get the goddamn bill out of the committee today. Yes, sir. 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, it passes the House and comes over to the Senate. The Senate votes on placing the Civil Rights Bill on the Senate calendar. It's a majority vote, 45 to 39. And at this stage, the South does not filibuster because they're going to have 2, 3, or maybe even 4 opportunities to do so in the future. But voting against putting the bill on the Senate calendar were those great racists, not Warren Magnuson from Washington State, Wayne Morris, the great liberal from Oregon, Mike Mansfield, the professor from the University of Montana, and Frank Church, who later headed up the CIA investigation. And magically, Hell's Canyon funding is passed the next day. Is passed the same day. Isn't that amazing? What a coincidence. Anthony Lewis, years later, after reading the Caro book, said he was the main writer for the New York Times on the Senate back then. Said, I thought I understood what was going on. I had no idea what was going on. I had no idea that Hell's Canyon was in any way related to the Civil Rights Bill. Now, the Southern senators hate the federal government, but they were willing to support the Civil Rights Bill, the Hell's Canyon bill in the Senate because Lyndon Johnson said, don't worry, guys, it'll never pass the House, so you don't have to worry about it ever being funded. And he was right. It never passed the House, and Hell's Canyon was never built. So that's a win for the South. Okay, it's Saturday, July 15th. Saturday. That's not a day that's usually great debates are held in the Senate. But this debate on civil rights is going through day by day with no break. Richard Russell gets up to speak. Silence in the Senate. This is one of those Daniel Webster moments, save the Union. And Russell gets up and says, look, I've been studying this bill, and we of the South have been deceived. The way the bill is written, federal troops can come into the South and enforce desegregation. The judge can put violators of Title III in jail for failure to comply. In other words, a federal judge could put an owner of a restaurant in jail for failure to serve a black person. We of the South will not allow the government to rule by injunction and bayonet. We are never going to be willing to go back to Reconstruction. Wow. Nobody had realized this, including President Eisenhower. He didn't know that you could send federal troops down south. He didn't realize that you could put people in jail without a jury trial. So when they asked Eisenhower about this, his response was, well, I'm not a lawyer, but wow, I didn't realize that this bill went this far. So this opened up the possibility now for a filibuster. And some Republicans and Western Democrats said, we're not going to vote for cloture until something is done to rectify this situation in Title III. Lyndon Johnson. Listen to what is not said in the debates, not just what is said. What are they talking about, but what are they not talking about? He's master of the timing of amendments. He's producer of the legislative play that will be played out in the U.S. Senate in a couple weeks. He's the director of the actors, formerly known as U.S. senators. He's a choreography of their speeches. And most importantly, he's the counter of votes. Johnson would have a yellow pad, and he'd have the name of every senator, and he'd have 3 columns, 1 for, the second against, the third unknown. And we'd put checks in these columns by pencil because Johnson knew that during the course of a debate over a particular bill, senators would change their minds. Now, many senators would aspirationally think or hope that someone would vote for the bill, but for Lyndon Johnson, that wasn't good enough. You had to absolutely know for certain. He realized that the U.S. Senate was not the Southern senators who were, arguing that they were protected by the United States Constitution. they weren't talking about Title IV, the voter rights bill. And the reason they weren't talking about it is how can you defend the Constitution of the United States but say that individual American citizens couldn't vote? So he realized that Title IV might pass, but it was not clear whether Title III could. LBJ secretly visits Eisenhower. He tells them if Title III is not deleted, the Civil Rights Bill is not going to pass. That wasn't necessarily true, but at least from Eisenhower's standpoint, it was a real possibility. He also said that he would block all of Eisenhower's proposals before the Senate. I caved, and he basically said, well, maybe Title III has to go. And Richard Russell would not compromise on Title III. Senator Anderson from New Mexico, a Western Democrat, he was, I think, Department of Agriculture Secretary under Franklin Roosevelt, is reading Title III while the debate drones on and on and on. And he tells Johnson, you know what? I don't see how Title III is going to pass. Let's strike it, and maybe we can get Title IV passed. Let's get a Southern senator to say, just strike, Title III and move on, and we'll pass Title IV. And Johnson instinctively says, no, you do it. You do it, Senator Anderson. We need a Western liberal senator to make this amendment. And more so, we need to get a co-sponsor, a good Republican liberal. So Anderson gets a co-sponsor, Senator Aiken from Vermont. Now, does anybody in the audience remember Senator Aiken from Vietnam? Oh, my God. Joe, geez, where are you when I need you? Senator Aiken's solution to the Vietnam War was, we just get out. And they said, how do you get out? And he said, walk. That was his solution. Both Anderson and Aiken are liberals. But if Russell would agree to an amendment on a jury trial to delete Title III, the South would agree not to filibuster the Civil Rights Bill coming off the calendar. Not that they're going to be for the Civil Rights Bill, but they won't filibuster. But remember, they can still filibuster as to any amendment, and they can still filibuster on the actual vote. The vote to allow the Civil Rights Bill to come off the calendar comes to a floor vote. Russell can filibuster. Russell can filibuster, but he doesn't. And the vote comes off the Senate floor, and one of the great scenes is Senator Johnson shaking hands with Senator Nolan from California. And both of them are smiling because Senator Johnson knew he had won, and Senator Nolan did not realize he had lost. The bill's off the calendar. Senator Anderson moves to strike Title III with Aiken as his co-sponsor. 18 Republicans vote for the amendment. The Western Democrats, the liberal Western Democrats, vote for the amendment as well. It passes 52-38. Title III outlawing segregation, the heart and the soul of the Civil Rights Act, is now deleted. Civil rights proponents are devastated. Many of them are saying, just screw it, we'll try to do it some other time. But some of the cooler heads said, look, at least some civil rights bill is better than no civil rights bill. Now the only civil rights bill remaining is Title IV, the Voting Rights Act. But Richard Russell says, I'm opposed to this because this doesn't have the right to a trial by jury. And unless there was a trial by jury, we're going to filibuster. Southern juries never supported black Americans, never supported civil rights. So if you allow a jury trial, you can have a civil rights statute, but it's not going to be enforced. Going back to Emmett Till, the Southern jury found the defendants not guilty. Now, the right to a jury trial is sacrosanct, especially to Western liberal senators who had been elected to office because they had put labor leaders in jail in the 1910s and 1920s without a trial by jury. The liberals would never agree to a trial by jury under Title IV because the law would never be enforced, but the Western senators realized that that was something that they absolutely had to have, trial by jury. How could LBJ find a way to compromise? Well, Western senators wanted a trial for jury for everything. And since we're talking about jury trials, Joe Legan, who's sitting in the audience, one of the great labor lawyers of the state of Florida, representing labor, said, you know, the Taft-Hartley Act outlawed trial by jury. Since we're talking about jury trials in the Civil Rights Bill, let's add a provision deleting the part of the Taft-Hartley Act that didn't allow jury trials. So LBJ convinces the Western senators to amend the statute to allow a trial by jury. And this would apply to labor disputes as well. Now labor will support the Civil Rights Bill. Okay, but if you can't get a trial by, if you have to have trial by jury when you hold somebody in contempt of court, the Civil Rights Bill is not going to be enforced. How many of you remember Benjamin Cohen? Heck, this is an audience that doesn't remember Jim Rowe. You're never going to remember Benjamin Cohen. Benjamin Cohen was this brilliant, idealistic young lawyer who wrote the SEC Act back in 1933. He's now practicing law in relative obscurity. But he calls up Lyndon Johnson and said, you know what? I just read a law review article regarding contempt of court. There are two types of contempt of court. Direct criminal contempt, where an individual disobeys a judge's order, but civil contempt. Civil contempt is you have the keys to the jail. For example, nobody in the audience is divorced. I am. Nobody in the audience is divorced. But the keys to the courthouse, you put somebody in jail for failure to pay child support. How do you get out of jail? You pay the child support. Well, the federal judges could put people in jail if a black man comes to register and the head of the register to vote and the head of the registry doesn't allow him to do so. You put him in jail until the registry agrees to allow the black person to register to vote. But even that was not enough for the liberal senators. There had to be something else to allow them for the bill to go forward. So if count 4 is amended, there'd be a right to a jury trial for criminal contempt, but there would also be no right to jury trial for civil contempt. But that was not enough for the civil rights proponents. Comes to the rescue Frank Church, freshman senator from Idaho. You know, I've been reading the federal statutes, and there's no guarantee that any American citizen can sit on a jury. That's left up to the states, and in the states in the South, you'd have to be registered to vote. What if we said that any American citizen over the age of 21 is entitled to sit on a jury in a federal case? That would mean black Americans could serve on juries. This would be acceptable to the South because the majority of the South are still white. And it was acceptable to the liberals because it would expand the jury pool. And to give you an idea of how profound that could have been, in Emmett Till, the county where Emmett Till was killed, 67% of the citizens of that county were black. And imagine if 67% of those jurors were black. So now we've got the compromise. Da, 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 da. We're now having the great Senate debate on civil rights. Senator O'Mahony, will you please stand? That's you, Joe. This is your moment in the sun. Senator O'Mahony, I'm speaking for the jury trial amendment. And I think that you should have the right to a trial by jury, and I think that for criminal contempt, but not necessarily for civil contempt. As Senator O'Mahony is speaking, Senator Church, who's sitting next to Senator, you're Senator Pastori, Roger, back down. Senator Church, Paul, if you'll stand. I'd like to make an amendment. Senator O'Mahony, you got to stand again, Joe. All right, what do you want to amend, Frank? Tell me what you want to do. I move, you can sit down now. I move that we expand the jury pool to apply in any federal case to any American. Now, Senator Pastori, stand. Gee, guys, you're hitting me with all this stuff. I don't understand it. Senator Pastori is the quote-unquote skeptic and knows exactly what's going on. But imagine if you're in the audience and you're watching this. I mean, just a hush over the entire Senate. Church makes his amendment to integrate federal juries. The Church amendment changes votes. The galleries are filled. History is being made. The Church amendment passes with Southern support. Sam Ervin votes for the amendment. Sam Ervin from North Carolina, a former judge and chairman of the Watergate subcommittee. The Republican bill is defeated. The amendments pass, but weeks later, the amended Democratic Civil Rights Bill passes 72-18. LBJ gets credit for passing the Civil Rights Act. 58 is a banner year for the Democratic Party. They elect 12 new senators. Part of that was both Hawaii and Alaska being admitted as states. So now the Senate is 65 Democrat, 35 Republican. Huge change. LBJ did the impossible. He was the great magician, Joan, the great magician. But he did this not for his personal beliefs, but purely political motives. He passed the Civil Rights Bill. That was his way of saying to the Democratic liberals, you can trust me, I will be your president. Now, the South didn't think there was a hope in hell that LBJ would ever support any of the liberal legislation. Boy, were they wrong. They had no idea that Johnson would pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was just as strong, if not stronger, than the one that was proposed by Eisenhower in 56 and 57. In 65, they passed the Voting Rights Act that had real teeth in it. And in 67, the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited discrimination against housing, the right to purchase a home. In 68, they passed the Public Broadcasting Act. And Mrs. Hauser, why is that so important?
Because your daughter is in charge of NPR in Illinois.
Well, not exactly quite that much. My wife said that my daughter's in charge of NPR in Southern Illinois. In Illinois, she's in charge of advertising in Southern Illinois, but we love her just as well. He passes Medicare. And one of the really classic, wonderful things that Johnson does is that when they signed the Medicare bill, who first suggested Medicare? Anybody know? Harry Truman. So when they go to sign the Medicare bill, he travels to Missouri and signs it in front of Harry Truman and gives him the pen. Harry Truman, number one?
His card said he was the first recipient.
Oh, he got the first pen. Okay, all right.
Not the pen, the card.
Medicare card. Oh, Harry Truman got the Medicare card. Okay. All right, okay. He enacted the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the mental health facilities. Passed anti-poverty programs, clean air, mine safety, Federal Highway Act, truth in lending, age discrimination. The bill passes. Kennedy's elected president in 1960. Johnson takes over in 63 after the assassination. In 1964, Henry Hauser, Lyndon Johnson is campaigning in Buffalo, New York. And what were his closing words at the speech in Buffalo, New York? Let's go Buffalo, as in Buffalo Bills. And And you too can root for the Buffalo Bills this Sunday when they play the hated Baltimore Ravens. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wait,
Thank you.
I saw some thumbs down on the Baltimore Ravens. I'm upset about that, but okay. The lady way in the back trying to hide now, but okay.
Obviously, we're asking for questions.
Jim, what did the Roberts Court do to weaken the Voting Rights Act?
What did what?
The Roberts Court do to weaken the Voting Rights Act?
You know, I think basically what they said is it's been in effect for 40 or 50 years. Time it's enough time. The South will never go back to segregation or intimidating blacks to vote. For example, in 2024, black Americans were called up and were told, we don't know who you're voting for, but we will know if you vote. And if you vote, we know where you live. Intimidation.
Was there anything left of the Voting Rights Act after that, do you know?
I think the answer is no. I don't know.
Yeah.
So that's the answer. That was a bad question that shows I don't know stuff.
I didn't mean to do that to you.
Yeah, yes, you did. Yes, you did. Any other questions? Yes.
So he did all this to become president, but he became president because Kennedy was assassinated. Kennedy might have run for a second term. How successful do you think he would have been in getting elected had Kennedy run for 2 terms?
In other words, could LBJ have run for president in '68?
Could he have gotten elected by himself without being?
No, I don't think LBJ could have. I don't think so. I think the Kennedy name was so magical that I think in '68 Bobby Kennedy would have won, and Bobby Kennedy would have run, and Kennedy would certainly have gotten the Democratic nomination. Oh, by the way, Randy Ellington, the '57 Civil Rights Bill that's passed. The last Civil Rights Bill was passed in 1875. How many years was that?
4 years ago, and I wanted to get the question right so you didn't scold me like you scolded Joe.
Oh, okay. That's correct, Randy. You get a gold star. Roger.
So, can that be, we did not hear what was said over here. Could that comment be repeated?
Randy said, go ahead.
4 years ago, and I didn't want to get the question wrong because I didn't want Jim to scold me like he scolded Jody Lieberman.
Roger.
Jim, my friend, Lyndon Johnson famously said, and I believe it's accurate, that the Civil Rights Bill will cost the Democratic Party the South. And so something about the South will go away from the Democratic Party.
Correct.
Can you talk a little bit about whether that was true? Did it really happen? And why did the South go from solid Democrat to solid Republican? And is it tied to that?
It's going on as we speak. The South is solidly Republican. Trump carried all of the southern states, except for Virginia. And the reason was that race was the primal issue in the South. The Democrats double-crossed the South on civil rights. Johnson thought it would be a generation before the South would come back to the Democratic fold. They did come back with Jimmy Carter for a limited period, but it's not a generation. What's that famous William Faulkner line? Paul, do you remember it? The past is never past. The past is never dead. Sometimes it's never past.
It isn't even past. He's talking about history there, Faulkner, I think.
Yeah. The past is never dead. Sometimes the past is not even past. The Civil War is still being fought.
There's Confederate flags all over,
Yes. Somebody else.